Kochi Jews, also called Malabar Jews, are of Mizrahi and Sephardi heritage. They are the oldest group of Jews in India, with possible roots claimed to date to the time of King Solomon. The Kochi Jews settled in the Kingdom of Kochi in South India, now part of the state of Kerala. As early as the 12th century, mention is made of the Black Jews in southern India. The Jewish traveller, Benjamin of Tudela, speaking of Kollam on the Malabar coast, writes in his itinerary, "Throughout the island, including all the towns thereof, live several thousand Israelites. The inhabitants are all black, and the Jews also. The latter are good and benevolent. They know the law of Moses and the prophets, and to a small extent the Talmud and Halachah. These people later became known as the Malabari Jews. They built synagogues in Kerala beginning in the 12th and 13th centuries. They are known to have developed Judeo-Malayalam, a dialect of Malayalam language. Following expulsion from Iberia in 1492 by the Alhambra decree, a few families of Sephardic Jews eventually made their way to Kochi in the 16th century. They became known as Paradesi Jews. The European Jews maintained some trade connections to Europe, and their language skills were useful. Although the Sephardim spoke Ladino, in India they learned Judeo-Malayalam from the Malabar Jews. The two communities retained their ethnic and cultural distinctions. In the late 19th century, a few Arabic-speaking Jews, who became known as Baghdadi, also immigrated to southern India, and joined the Paradesi community. After India gained its independence in 1947 and Israel was established as a nation, most Kochi Jews emigrated from Kerala to Israel in the mid-1950s. Most white Jews though prefer to migrate to Australia and other Commonwealth countries, as Anglo-Indians did. Most of their synagogues have been sold and adapted for other uses. The Paradesi Synagogue still has a congregation and also attracts tourists as a historic site. The synagogue at Chernamangalam was reconstructed in 2006. The one at Parur is currently being reconstructed. Descendants of Kochi Jews have had their DNA analyzed. A 2009 DNA report states that Ethiopian Jews and Indian Jews maternally cluster with neighboring autochthonous populations in Ethiopia and Western India, respectively, despite a clear paternal link between the Bene Israel and the Levant. History. First Jews in South India. P.M. Jusse wrote that it was believed that the earliest Jews in India were sailors from King Solomon's time. It has been claimed that following the destruction of the First Temple in the Siege of Jerusalem of 587 BC, some Jewish exiles came to India. Only after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE records found that attest to numerous Jewish settlers arriving at Cranganore, an ancient port near Kochi. Cranganore, now transliterated as Kodungalur, but also known under other names, is a city of legendary importance to this community. Fernandez writes, "It is a substitute Jerusalem in India." Katz and Goldberg note the symbolic intertwining of the two cities. In 1768, a certain Tobias Boas of Amsterdam had posed 11 questions to Rabbi Yehezkel Rachbi of Kochi. The first of these questions addressed to the said rabbi concerned the origins of the Jews of Kochi and the duration of their settlement in India. In Rabbi Yehezkel's handwritten response, he wrote, "After the destruction of the Second Temple, in the year 3828 of Annamundi, i.e., 68 of the Christian era, about 10,000 men and women had come to the land of Malabar and were pleased to settle in 4 places, those places being Cranganore, Deshalalore, Madai, and Plotter. Most were in Cranganore, which is also called Magodera. It is also called St. Gale. St. Thomas, one of the disciples of Jesus, is believed to have visited India while proselytizing. It is possible that many of the Jews who became Christians at that time were absorbed by what became the Nazrana or St. Thomas Christians. The Narnaya subgroup of the Nazrana Christians claim a Jewish heritage and are known for having similar customs and rituals as the Kochi Jews. Central to the history of the Kochi Jews was their close relationship with Indian rulers. This was codified on a set of copper plates granting the community special privileges. The date of these plates, known as Sazanam, is contentious. The plates are physically inscribed with the date 379 CE, but in 1925, tradition was setting it as 1069 CE. Indian rulers granted the Jewish leader Joseph Rabban the rank of prince over the Jews of Kochi, giving him the rulership and tax revenue of a pocket principality in Anjavanim near Kranganore, and rights to 72 free houses. The Hindu king gave permission in perpetuity for Jews to live freely, build synagogues, and own property, without conditions attached. A family connection to Rabban, the king of Shingali, was long considered a sign of both purity and prestige within the community. Rabban's descendants led this distinct community until her chieftainship dispute broke out between two brothers. One of them, named Joseph Azar, disambiguation needed. In the 16th century, the oldest known gravestone of a Kochi Jew is written in Hebrew and dates to 1269 CE. It is near the Chandamangalam Synagogue, built in 1614. It is now operated as a museum. In 1341, a disastrous flood silted up the port of Kranganore, and trade shifted to a smaller port at Kochi. Many of the Jews moved quickly, and within 4 years, they had built their first synagogue at the new community. The Portuguese Empire established a trading beachhead in 1500, and until 1663 remained the dominant power. They continued to discriminate against the Jews, although doing business with them. A synagogue was built at Paru in 1615, at a site that, according to tradition, had a synagogue built in 1165. Almost every member of this community emigrated to Israel in 1954. In 1524, the Muslims, backed by the ruler of Calicut, attacked the wealthy Jews of Kranganore because of their primacy in their lucrative pepper trade. The Jews fled south to the Kingdom of Kochi, seeking the protection of the Kochi royal family. The Hindu Raja of Kochi gave them asylum. Moreover, he exempted Jews from taxation but bestowed on them all privileges enjoyed by the taxpayers. The Malabari Jews built additional synagogues at Malur and Ernakulam. In the latter location, Kadavimbargam Synagogue was built about 1200 and restored in the 1790s. Its members believed they were the congregation to receive the historic copper plates. In the 1930s and 1940s, the congregation was as large as 2,000 members, but all emigrated to Israel. Thekkumbargam Synagogue was built in Ernakulam in 1580, and rebuilt in 1939. It is the synagogue in Ernakulam sometimes used for services if former members of the community visit from Israel. In 1998, 5 families who were members of this congregation still lived in Kerala or in Madras. A Jewish traveler's visit to Kochi. The following is a description of the Jews of Kochi by 16th-century Jewish traveler Zechariah Dahiri 1660 independence. The Paradesi Jews, also called White Jews, settled in the Kochi region in the 16th century and later. Following the expulsion from Iberia due to forced conversion and religious persecution in Spain and then Portugal, some fled north to Holland, but the majority fled east to the Ottoman Empire. Some went beyond that territory, including a few families who followed the Arab spice routes to southern India. Speaking Ladino language and having Sephardic customs, they found the Malabari Jewish community as established in Kochi to be quite different. According to the historian Mandelbaum, there were resulting tensions between the two ethnic communities. The European Jews had some trade links to Europe and useful languages to conduct international trade, i.e., Arabic, Portuguese and Spanish, later on maybe Dutch. These attributes helped the position both financially and politically. When the Portuguese occupied the Kingdom of Kochi, they allegedly discriminated against its Jews. Nevertheless, to some extent they shared language and culture, so ever more Jews came to live under Portuguese rule. The Protestant Dutch killed the Raja of Kochi, allied of the Portuguese, plus 1,600 Indians in 1662, during their siege of Kochi. The Jews, having supported the Dutch military attempt, suffered the murderous retaliation of both Portuguese and Malabar population. A year later, the Second Dutch siege was successful and, after slaughtering the Portuguese, they fanatically demolished most Catholic churches or turned them into Protestant churches. Nevertheless, they were more tolerant of the Jews, having given many asylum in the Netherlands. This attitude differs with the antisemitism of the Dutch in New York under Peter Stuyvesant around those years. The Malabari Jews built 7 synagogues in Kochi, reflecting the size of their population. The Paradesi Jews built one, the Paradesi Synagogue. The latter group was very small by comparison to the Malabaris. Both groups practiced endogamous marriage, maintaining their distinctions. Both communities claimed special privileges and the greater status over each other. It is claimed that the white Jews had brought with them from Iberia a few score mashut rerum. Although free, they were relegated to a subordinate position in the community. These Jews formed a third subgroup within Kochi Jewry. The mashut rerum were not allowed to marry white Jews and had to sit in the back of the synagogue. These practices were similar to the discrimination against converts from lower castes sometimes found in Christian churches in India. In the early 20th century, Abraham Barak Salem, a young lawyer who became known as If Jewish Gandhi, worked to end the discrimination against mashut rerum Jews. Inspired by Indian nationalism and Zionism, he also tried to reconcile the divisions among the Kochi Jews. He became both an Indian nationalist and Zionist. His family were descended from mashut rerum. The Hebrew word denoted a manumitted slave, and was at times used in a derogatory way. Salem fought against the discrimination by boycotting the Paradesi Synagogue for a time. He also used satyagraha to combat the social discrimination. According to Mandelbaum, by the mid-1930s many of the old taboos had fallen with the changing society. The Kokini and Javanam Jews also migrated to Malaya. Records show that they were settled in Seremban, Negri Sembilan, Malaysia. The last descendant of Kochi Jews in Seremban is Benjamin Mayeshim. Relations between the Kochi Jews and the Bene Israel. Although India is noted for having 4 distinct Jewish communities, viz., Kochi, Bene Israel, Calcutta and New Delhi, communications between the Jews of Kochi and the Bene Israel community were greatest in the mid-19th century. According to native Bene Israel historian Haim Samuel Kahimkar, several prominent members from the white Jews of Kochi had moved to Bombay in 1825 from Kochi, of whom are specifically named Michael and Abraham Sargon, David Baruch Rahabi, Hashem Samuel and Judah David Ashkenazi. These exerted themselves not only in edifying the minds of the Bene Israel and of their children generally, but also particularly in turning the minds of these few of the Bene Israel, who through heathen influence had gone astray from the path of the holy religion of their forefathers to a right direction, viz., to the study of their own religion, and to the contemplation on the Supreme Being. David Rahabi was engaged in effecting a religious revival at Rivandana, followed by his successor Hashem Samuel. Although David Rahabi was convinced that the Bene Israel were the descendants of the Jews, he still wanted to examine them further. He therefore gave their women clean and unclean fish to be cooked together, but they singled out the clean from the unclean ones, saying that they never used fish that had neither fins nor scales. Being thus satisfied, he began to teach them the tenets of the Jewish religion. He taught Hebrew reading, without translation, to 3 Bene Israel young men from the families of Jiratka, Shapurka and Rajpurka. David Rahabi is said to have been killed as a martyr in India, 2 or 3 years after coming upon the Bene Israel. He was killed by a local chief. Another influential man from Kochi, who is alleged to have been of Yemenite Jewish origin, was Hashem Shlomo Salem Shurabi, who served as a husband or a reader, in the then newly formed Synagogue of the Bnei Israel in Bombay for the trifling sum of rupees 100 per annum. Although he worked also as a bookbinder, while engaged in his avocation, he was at all times ready to explain any scriptural difficulty that might happen to be brought to him by any Bnei Israel. He was a reader, preacher, expounder of the law, Mohel and Shoshe. He served the community for about 18 years, and died on the 17th of April 1856. Since 1947, India is the only part of Eurasia where anti-Semitism never took a root in spite of having a sizable Jewish population in the past. India became independent from British occupation in 1947 and Israel established itself as a nation in 1948. With the heightened emphasis on the partition of India into a secular Republic of India and a semi-theocratic Pakistan, most of the Kochi Jews emigrated from India. Generally they went to Israel. Many from the migrants joined the Moshavim of Nevatim, Shahar, Yuval, and Mesilate Zion. Others settled in the neighborhood of Katamon in Jerusalem, and in Beersheba, Ramla, Dimona and Yeruam, where many Bnei Israel had settled. Since the late 20th century, former Kochi Jews have also immigrated to the United States. In Kochi, the Paradesi Synagogue is still active as a place of worship, but the Jewish community is very small. The building also attracts visitors as a historic tourist site. As of 2008, the ticket seller at the synagogue, Yara Halagwa, is the last female Paradesi Jew of childbearing age in the community. Traditions and way of life. The 12th century Jewish traveller Benjamin of Tudela wrote about the Malabari coast of Kerala. The inhabitants are all black, and the Jews also. The latter are good and benevolent. They know the law of Moses and the prophets, and to a small extent the Talmud and Halachah. European Jews sent texts to the community of Kochi Jews to teach them about normative Judaism. Maimonides, the preeminent Jewish philosopher of his day, wrote, "Only lately some well-to-do men came forward and purchased 3 copies of my code, the Mishneh Torah, which they distributed through messengers. Thus the horizon of these Jews was widened and the religious life in all communities as far as India revived." In a 1535 letter sent from Safed, Israel to Italy, David Del Rossi wrote that a Jewish merchant from Tripoli had told him the India town of Shingali had a large Jewish population who dabbled in yearly pepper trade with the Portuguese. As far as their religious life, he wrote, they only recognized the code of Maimonides and possessed no other authority or traditional law. According to the contemporary historian Nathan Katz, Rabbi Nissim of Gerona visited the Kochi Jews. They preserve in their songbooks the poem he wrote about them. In the Kadavim Bargam Synagogue, a Hebrew school was available for both children's education and adult study of Torah and Mishnah, the Jewish Encyclopedia said. They hold the same doctrines, use the same ritual, observe the same feasts and fasts, dress alike, and have adopted the same language Malayalam. The two classes are equally strict in religious observances, according to Martin Chemana. The Jews of Kochi coalesced around the religious fundamentals, devotion and strict obedience to biblical Judaism and to the Jewish customs and traditions. Hebrew, taught through the Torah texts by rabbis and teachers who came especially from Yemen. The Jews of Kochi had a long tradition of singing devotional hymns and songs on festive occasions, as well as women singing Jewish prayers and narrative songs in Judeo-Malayalam. They did not adhere to the Talmudist prohibition against public singing by women.